Welcome back. Our next speaker is Annamaria Pinter, who's giving our second plenary of the web conference. Annamaria is an Associate Professor at the Centre for Applied Linguistics at the University of Warwick. Her research interests include all aspects of second and foreign language learning for children. She is the author of Teaching Young Language Learners, second edition 2017, published by Oxford University Press. We're delighted to have you, Annamaria. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for this very generous introduction. Can you all hear me? Hopefully everyone can hear me. Okay, so in the next 50 minutes or so, I'm going to talk about one of my favorite topics, which is researching with children. And as you can see from the title, I also put whatever their age. So my aim today is to give you examples of researching with children from very young children indeed, who are still in preschool, and also primary children, lower primary, upper primary, and then also with secondary children or teenagers as well. So this title actually wasn't my idea when I was first contacted by David. It was his idea that we go for this, and I'm hoping that wherever you work and whatever age group you're focusing on, you will find something useful in this talk. Please keep the questions and the comments coming. I'm going to try and keep an eye on those in the right-hand side, on the box right-hand side. And yes, and first of all, thank you to all of you who logged in with an interest this evening. It's quite late for me. It's 6 o'clock in the UK, and I understand for some of you it's even later in the evening. So thank you very much. So as a bit of background to all of this, I just want to show you snippets of ideas that really inspired me years and years ago when I first decided to look into researching with children. So these ideas come from a sociological approach to studying children, and it's called the New Childhood Studies. And basically, this approach to studying children grew out of the criticism that traditionally children in research are always passive. They often don't even know research is going on, and certainly their ideas and views are not traditionally taken into account. So quite a lot of researchers in sociology many decades ago started to take an interest in a different approach. And so this is a different perspective, a different approach to studying children. And I guess the first important thing to remember is we're looking at children not just as passive and vulnerable, because of course they're vulnerable, that's not going to go away, but we also look at children as active, capable subjects who can make decisions, who have their own views and opinions, and they just need opportunities to express these. So some people in this particular paradigm believe that children are, to some extent, experts of their own lives. And I guess all of us have been children and remember great things from our childhood, or maybe not so great things. But just because we were children, I suppose we cannot have a very direct experience of what childhood means today. And that's why it's kind of impossible for us adults to understand children if we're only looking at them from our own point of view. If children's perspectives are important and they need to be sought, they need to also be taken seriously. So it's no good asking children's views and then not really do anything with it, because they will soon realize that you're not really asking. You're just asking, but actually you have no intention listening. So some of the researchers in this particular paradigm went as far as saying that in research studies, we also have an opportunity to take children more seriously. We can work with them as co-researchers, and they can even do research themselves. So this is actually the angle and the area that I'm really interested in. And I'm quite aware, looking at the audience, that a few of my colleagues and friends have sort of heard me talk about this before. How many of you recognize what this is? So this is the first page of a very important document. So just write in the right-hand chat box, please, if you recognize this document. I'll just give you 1 second, or maybe a couple of seconds. Yes, so a lot of you have already identified it. So this is the United Nations Conventions of the Rights of the Child, first page of the document. And this is a document that was ratified in 1989, so a long time ago now, and nearly all countries of the world signed up to this. So this is a document that is not without its problems, but the basic idea of the document is to protect children's rights wherever they are. And of course, children in this document, according to this document, have got lots of rights that I can't go into today, but some of the rights center around listening to their opinions and views about important things in life. So here is a simplified version of this document. You can see that this is written with a view that it might be shared with children. So some of you might like to do this at some point in your practice, sharing the document, getting children's views and ideas about what they understand and know about this document and their own rights. Because of course they might not know about it. Now, within the document, researchers who are interested in working with children as co-researchers are particularly interested in Article 12, which talks about the children's rights to express their views freely on all matters affecting them. And then these views ought to be given also due consideration. So this is really the nitty-gritty article that much of the theoretical work that has been done in sociology keeps coming back to. And here is a simplified version of it. Again, this is something that you can even share with primary school children. You've got the right to an opinion and for it to be listened to and taken seriously. So with that little introduction, I would like to just take a slide and talk a little bit about my understanding of research, because I guess this is quite important in terms of talking about researching with children's active participation. So I guess it's important to say that there is research that I call with a small r and research that I call with a capital R. And I think all of this can be considered research. And research is always about exploring things and finding answers, but not just randomly, like looking things up on Google. That can be part of it. But it needs to be more systematic. It needs to be around a particular question and then trying to get to the end of that issue or problem. But whatever research we're looking at, whether at a very high level or low level, it's still exploring things systematically. So in very broad terms, there is, of course, academic research, the kind of research that people do in universities. And this is research that generally gets published in special journals. And actually very few people read this. Maybe other academic researchers read each other's work. But beyond that, this research is kind of up there and not really accessible. Then there is, in our kind of field, there is, of course, practitioner research. So, for example, teachers can become practitioner researchers and they may undertake more formal or less formal action research or exploratory practice. And I would like to argue that children's research can also happen, and it is also part of this big picture. And this is where my little illustrations hopefully become meaningful. So the way I see this is, as a child, you might start your path as a young researcher, and you may just be a very small plant. And as you do more and more research and have more and more opportunities to find out about research, maybe learn new subtleties about it, become more sophisticated with your tools, you may grow into a bigger plant, and eventually you may grow into a huge tree very interested in research. But of course, children don't all have to do that, but it's a possibility. And I like this larvae and bug picture as well, because at each point, as you develop, you actually turn into something else, somebody perhaps qualitatively different. And this also is something that maybe I will come back to, but it can signify that development as you go along can lead to big jumps and leaps when you suddenly become a very different type of researcher. So, for example, a lot of teacher researchers I've worked with in my project decided to take up academic research and take the next step to go into something that for many of them was a qualitatively very different experience and approach to research. So in this very broad framework, all the research, I guess, from the very bottom to the very top, from the small r to the capital R, is considered research. So before I move on, showing you now some examples of the type of research activities that can be undertaken with children, with their involvement from preschool up to secondary. Let me just again give you a second, and if you could write back in the chat box to me whether you have read about this kind of research before, or maybe you have done this kind of research before. So those of you who are familiar with it and have got their own experience, could you just say, yes, yes, I've done this before? Okay, so that's very helpful to me. So a lot of people are saying, no, they haven't done this before. This is new to them. Other people are saying, yes, they have seen this before, have done this before. So this is really good, because I think then when it comes to questions, we can address both those interests. Okay, so let me start with possible research involving preschoolers. So I've taken inspiration from what we call the Mosaic approach. And this is in particular related to two scholars' work, Clark and Moss. At the end of the presentation, I will give you all the references. I'm trying not to refer to too many things, but maybe 3 or 4, and I will give you the full references at the end for those of you who want to take this away. But if you Google Clark and Moss, lots and lots of ideas will come up, and they've published a lot. And this is just one example, the 2001 publication. Now, the Mosaic approach, the words speak for themselves. A mosaic is built up of very small pieces. And it's only when you look at all the pieces together, you see a beautiful picture, and you see something else, something perhaps more meaningful than the sum of the small pictures. So the approach means that you involve very young children in expressing their opinions about something. So this could be, for example, a research question could be, what do the children enjoy about learning English? But it also could be about what do they like about the school building, or what do they like about the teacher, or what do they like about school routines. It can be absolutely anything. And what the Mosaic approach does is basically allows the children to take photos or draw pictures in relation to the question. And you can do this in many different ways. You can just allow them to draw or take as many pictures as they like, or maybe you can limit it to 2 and 3. You can maybe limit it to a couple of pictures per group. Sometimes groups can draw pictures as well or take photos. Photos are really good because they work quickly and they give you an instantaneous image. And photos can be deleted or thrown away if no longer wanted. And children really enjoy taking photos. So it would work well as well alongside drawings. And then, of course, it's important that they get chances to talk about photos and drawings. So children might not like to sit down and talk to you about the photos in a very formal way. Sometimes they like to walk around and talk about things. You may want to allow them to think about it and come to you and tell you about their drawing and photo when they have had the chance to think. However, because this is an English class, there is always the opportunity to maybe write something. No, sorry, they won't be able to write something then, but to repeat and practice with what they're saying about their photo or their drawing, even if it's just 2-3 sentences. And sometimes this repetition and wanting to introduce your own drawing and photo actually gives you the motivation to want to do it in English as well. It may be in the first language, it may be bilingual, it may be possible to encourage them to do it in English. And then once you are completed the mosaic and you've got everybody's pictures, you can maybe count certain types of pictures, summarize, interpret, depending on what the group is interested in. But even if the children are no longer interested to take this further, the mosaic approach and its power is in showing the adults something through the children's eyes that perhaps wasn't visible before. So following the mosaic approach, it is possible, even with 3, 4, 5-year-olds, to really push the agenda of getting their views, getting their opinions, and listening to their views about something within the English classroom. If you do this regularly, of course, it will help. It might be possible for those who can already write a little bit to also annotate their drawings. So there's lots and lots of possibilities to modify and take this further. So if we move on to lower primary years, and this is when children are maybe 6, 7, or 8 years old, they can already write a little bit perhaps, and they've been at school for certainly a longer period of time. So again, I've taken inspiration from somebody's work, somebody who's called Kopok, 2011. Again, I will show you this reference later on. And in this particular article, the researcher worked with children who were engaged in peer interviews. So one possible research question could be, for example, what kind of internet games are played in Year 4 classrooms? So following the advice of this researcher, what you would do is, first of all, talk to children about interviews, tell them this means asking questions. And when we ask people the same sort of questions, and when we ask several people, we will get some interesting insights because they may have different opinions. Then the researcher suggested putting children in pairs, so letting them decide the roles. One will be the scribe, So somebody who will be writing down the answers or noting down the answers, and the other one will be the interviewer. Depending on the children's interest, you may also want to elicit, formulate some questions. So how do you ask a question about internet games? So it may be necessary to talk through the wording of some of these questions with the children. And again, depending on whether you're doing this in the first language or the second language or bilingually or only in English, you may need to translate, you may need to work with two versions, or they may be ready to do it in English. It depends on the context. The children then interview another year for class so that it's meaningful. They get some real data from real people. And again, they don't need to interview a lot of people. Maybe each pair will interview 8 children, something like that. And then the responses are combined and analyzed, and maybe posters or mini presentations are put together. So for example, here in the corner, I've got something very simple like ice cream preferences, where children would have asked how many prefer which flavor, and then created this very simple graph. But it's not necessary that graphs are created. It may be just that numbers are put against the different types of games or types of ideas that they managed to pull out of the interviews. So then we move on to upper primary, and here I would like to use my own example in the sense that I have actually done this work myself in a local primary school with year 5 children who are about 10 years old, 9 to 10. And I was running what I called in the school a research club. And basically every Friday afternoon for 6 weeks, I met up with a small group of children. And I was just interested to find out whether they would be at all interested in doing some research by themselves. So you can imagine these were children who'd never done any research and never understood anything at all about social research, the kind of research that I was flagging to them. Again, I was inspired by somebody else's work. So this is a book that I highly recommend if you're interested in this topic, How to Develop Children as Researchers by Mary Kellett. It's somebody who works at the Open University, and this is looking at developing child researchers. And there are some very practical descriptions of tasks that you can do with children, and people at this research center actually do go out to schools and have a whole website devoted to children's research, examples of children's research. So I was very inspired by this, and I thought, I wonder whether I float this idea to some 9-year-olds, what is going to be the response? And I had a very mixed group. Children, some children where English was their second language, and they were much stronger in another language. Some children were not high achievers at all, and they were more sort of middling children. And some that I even had someone in the group who had serious learning difficulties. And I specifically asked for a group like this because Mary Kellett and other people who write about this, they do say that this works really well with teenagers, for example, but usually it's the high achievers, the highly motivated kids, the ones who always volunteer for everything. They're the ones who get involved in all these projects, and therefore we know very little about how it might work with younger children who are not high achievers and not necessarily used to being the stars in their classes. So what did I do? I can't talk about it in much detail today because that would take up probably another hour on its own, but I will just give you a flavor of it. So the children designed and analyzed their own questionnaires. So the steps I've taken were like this. First of all, I inspired them with examples of child research from the internet. So I downloaded from the OU site actually quite a lot of examples, which the children liked, and they were quite surprised that there is a website where children's research is showcased. And then I also taught some research terminology and practiced these through games. Now, remember, I didn't talk about research terminology or teaching research terminology to younger children, but these children actually were very interested in learning things like what is bias in a question, or what is research ethics, or what is Likert scale question. And this was a big surprise to me because I didn't know what the response would be, but they were very interested, especially when I said that these are very adult ideas and they're quite hard to grapple with. And it was okay if they were not able to remember them. So they all did. So then we filled in a questionnaire. So this was a questionnaire that was designed by one of my graduate students for another purpose. But I used it here because I was very aware that these children probably had never seen a questionnaire. So how are they going to design their own without ever filling one in? So they filled in one questionnaire and they sort of evaluated it. They tried to say, okay, these questions are pretty good, or this is a Likert square question, this is the introduction, this is the I don't know, this I don't like this question because are probably not very well designed. And then they designed their own questionnaires on the computer, and then we distributed this within the school. So some were for teachers, some were for classmates, some were for children in other classes. So for example, 2 boys decided to do something which was comparing year 1 and year 5 children game playing behaviors. So they were very ambitious. Some of them were very ambitious indeed. And amazingly, those who felt less able perhaps to do this, they were less ambitious in their design, and those who were more able, they were more ambitious in their design, but everybody completed it. Everybody designed a questionnaire. And then the data came back, and that was a big moment where they actually finally understood what this all means. They all enjoyed looking at their own data. They all thought, gosh, these people took the time to answer it. So they were lapping it up, and in fact, some of them wanted to stay beyond the usual hours on a Friday afternoon to finish the analysis. And then they all completed presentations about their research, which we recorded on MP3 players and iPads. And the ones who completed, I put them up on my website, and they were extremely proud of themselves. And they felt like they accomplished something, they achieved something that they never thought would be possible. So they were all very impressed that this was going to go up on the website. So here are a couple of questions. You can see some of the children here working on the pair in the left-hand side, top corner, they working on their presentation. So somebody's holding the iPad and the other pair is talking about what is on the screen. The girls underneath are looking at their own analysis and completing their own analysis. In the right-hand side, there's a graph where some of the data was actually summarized from their questionnaires like this. They all absolutely loved graphs. If you ask me, they're really boring and actually quite hard to make. But we showed them, or I showed them how to make them, and they were extremely keen to make these. And here's a questionnaire, an example of a questionnaire that they made. It's not perfect, but again, my point is, you know, if a graduate student created a questionnaire like this, I would probably say, well, go back and do better. But you have to start somewhere. So these are the sort of rudimentary bases of social research. You learn that you can only ask one question at a time. You use visuals effectively. You introduce your questionnaire. You sign off. You have tick answers. You have yes and no questions. So it's pretty good for the kind of training that they had. So moving on very quickly, I want to talk a little bit further about how to take this even further with secondary students. And of course, the limit is the sky, as we say. And here is the British Council handbook that comes from a project that I was involved in with several of my colleagues that also involved a lot of Indian teachers. And this handbook contains some of the best ideas from this project. And you can see that these teachers also attempted to work with children as co-researchers. And it's mainly primary material, but there are a couple of good examples of secondary level projects as well. So I'm going to show you something from this handbook to make it a bit more authentic, in the sense that the example is coming from Samaras from a very different context. This is, by the way, freely downloadable from the British Council site if anyone wants to look at it. And there's also a summary of the actual research project that we completed, which is somewhere there else also to be downloaded. So as you may have noticed, I have a bit of a theme going here, because going back all the way to the pre-primary children, we have got the interviews and the questionnaires as the main theme. This is not to suggest, of course, that other type of research is not possible with children, with the involvement of children. But it does suggest that this is the type of thing that tends to be talked about and written about a lot. And perhaps this is one within our field that makes a lot of sense, because it chimes really well with asking learners about their opinions, about their learning, about giving us feedback about how things are going in the class. So in that sense, it's not a surprise, perhaps, that quite a lot of my examples are interviews. So this is also designing interviews, but this is with teenagers, so 13 years old or above. And you have seen now that in the primary school, there were little interviews done in pairs. You did see my primary children with the questionnaires, that they were perhaps a little more sophisticated. Now, if we look at this, we can see that in terms of the research techniques, this is taken a little further. So first, they start by looking at interviews on YouTube, examples, and brainstorm ideas about what makes a good interview. Again, depending on where you work and language levels, this may have to be bilingual, or this may have to be done in the first language. But I will come to that, because in all of this, even if a lot of it has to be in the first language, the final product, the presentations, the actual analysis, the actual outcome, which is the most important thing, is always something that the children will want to do it in English. So after brainstorming what makes a good interview, then the children were divided in groups, and each group selected a group leader. So the group leader helps to navigate things within the group, especially if you've got a really large class, which in India was the case for many of these teachers that we worked with. And then each group also decides to select a topic. So with teenagers, you can really have very exciting topics that they are interested in, something to do with their own lives, their own environments. It can be about learning and English learning, and ideally within the English class, that would make a lot of sense. So for example, let's have a look at how we learn new vocabulary, or let's have a look at what the advantages or disadvantages might be of collaborative learning, or let's have a look at how different people practice grammar. So you could have all sorts of English learning related topics, but you don't have to, because the English lesson is also for talking about real stuff, about stuff that matters to kids. And in my experience, when you allow them to work on topics that really matter to them, it adds an extra layer of motivation to what they do. So then you also have to think about who you're going to interview. So rather than just interview your own classmates, you may want to interview teachers or other staff in the school, or someone in your community, or some parents, or someone in the library. You have to be careful, of course, with ethical issues and who can go where with whom. But it is possible to have a more interesting set of interviewees than just always each other. So each group then wrote their draft questions for the interview. So this is important because they already are working on what makes a good interview question. Then they piloted their questions with each other, but also exchanged feedback between the groups. So depending on how many groups you have, you may say, okay, you guys in this group, give your questions to the other group, exchange, have a look at each other's questions, and try to improve each other's questions. Now, the interviews, of course, may still be in the first language, depending on who you're planning to interview, but I would suggest that at this stage, they could work at least bilingually with these questions. So this is where actually the example from the handbook finishes, but there are some next steps that you can take from here. Obviously, you need to go and conduct the interviews. You can also transcribe the interviews. Now, this is no small feat to transcribe an interview, and not everyone will be interested in doing that. But I have had learners that I worked with who wanted to do this and took great deal of interest as to how to do this. What do you do with the shortened words? What do you do with the long pauses? What do you do with the intonation? And these are actually research skills. You don't have to go all the way and teach them everything you know, and probably you don't know everything either, but it may be a step forward for some people to want to transcribe interviews. You may not need to transcribe the whole lot, just to experience what it's like and what it actually gives you in terms of then looking at the content. So then analysis, coding and looking for themes. Again, a lot of people in sociology, in the research in sociology, have shown us that this is possible. Some teenagers will be interested in doing this. If they're not interested, then I wouldn't push it, because if they don't want to do it, it will not lead to anything good. But in any case, once you've done the interviews and put in the effort and you've got some interesting results, one way or another, you may want to write up your results for a purpose, maybe for a school presentation, maybe for something bigger than that. Maybe it can be uploaded to a secure website where people can see it and admire it. Because if you just put it in a dark drawer as a teacher and never do anything with it, then it wasn't really very meaningful. And it's certainly not meaningful in a research sense, because the research needs to be disseminated. So it needs to go somewhere. It needs to find audience that is interested in it. And in my experience with the primary children and with the children in the study we did in India was the same. Once they finished it, there was this huge excitement. They were very, very pleased with themselves. It's extremely empowering to be able to say, I've done this piece of research with my friend. They completed, they uploaded, everyone likes it. So they want to do the obvious thing. They want to do more. They want to do something else. They probably already have the idea what they want to do next. And they want to do better. And this is again where my little Klein from going low-level research to higher-level research hopefully makes sense. Because if you want to do better, then there may well be something that you can learn at that point which will take you, in terms of your technical skills as a researcher, to the next level. So today I haven't planned to talk very much about the linguistic benefits of this because I don't have the time. I want to finish with thinking about ethical issues, but also thinking about the label of age. But probably if you have done this kind of work in the past, you may agree with me there are lots of linguistic benefits as well. When children get into this kind of work, they're motivated, they want to do it. You know, the first thing that happens is if there's some kind of an outcome, a presentation, they keep practicing, they want to practice, they want to polish it, they notice things in each other's performances and help each other. They are extremely keen to polish their final project because it's going somewhere. And therefore, you don't need to tell them twice to try and correct the mistakes in it. So this also gives people confidence. It also allows them to work together meaningfully in a way that perhaps many ordinary tasks don't allow. Okay, so I've just got, I don't know what, yeah. So I've got this strange slide because when I talk about this, it is my experience that teachers often turn around and say to me, well, it's interesting, but how is this different from just good, sensible, child-centered teaching or project work? We do projects, so we ask children to interview each other. We ask children to look for resources and come up with you know, a project and share their findings about something that they found on Google. And I have spent a lot of time thinking about this, and I think my answer to this very sensible question is that at the bottom of it, of course, it is child-centered teaching, and of course, it is a type of meaningful project work, doing your own research or working together with someone as a co-researcher. But I see a very important layer on top of this. And that layer is the research training. So depending on the readiness and the interest of the children, they may want to, for example, learn terminology. They may want to understand about things like what is a biased question. They may want to know more about how you analyze data or how you, I don't know, how you avoid ethical problems. The children in the primary school I worked with were certainly very interested in all these aspects. But I'm not trying to claim that they became academic researchers. Of course they didn't. But I think as long as this layer is there, or as long as this layer is something that the teacher is constantly thinking about, it is actually, I think, to my mind, more than just good, solid, child-centered teaching and project work. And I'm not saying everyone should, I'm just saying that that is where I see the difference. But of course, this also has got some implications for teachers, and there are also issues, ethical and other dilemmas, and I don't like to pretend that it's completely unproblematic. So one thing that we grappled with in the Indian study is, for example, to see where the dividing line is between formal research and less formal research. Because if you work with children as researchers within your own classroom, you may just consider that informal research. You may just feel that it's part of your everyday work and you're simply embedding the research skills into teaching. But if you, for example, decide to present your work at a conference like this, or write about it more formally, then suddenly a whole lot of other formal ethical issues might apply. And it is really quite difficult for people to navigate this borderline between more formal and less formal research. So that's one issue. Involving children as researchers also, I suppose, presupposes a particular approach to teaching and learning. It does favor a class where there is attempts to develop autonomy or more democratic approaches to teaching and learning. And if this is not happening, if your classroom environment is very different from that, then it's going to be very difficult to embed anything like this. And then there are very important consequences for teachers as role models. So if you're encouraging your children to become researchers, then what does that say about a teacher who is not a researcher? Can a teacher who is not a researcher work in this way? Well, it's going to be very difficult. So it has got implications for adults as well. And the whole idea of giving children voice, giving children the opportunity to share their opinions and giving them agency is actually quite a contested issue, because agency, of course, is not a product, it's not a commodity that you can just hand over. There are some serious limitations where children are not able to exercise their agency, in the sense that they're restricted by very formal structures. Children may exercise their agency in other ways, for example, by keeping silent or resisting your ideas, and this can happen as well. We shouldn't pretend that every time you allow children to have agency, it will just be taken up and everything will be absolutely fine. So these are all sort of dilemmas and things to think about. And finally, this is my last slide, and after this, I'm going to have a go at perhaps looking in the chat box and answering any questions. So if you do have any global questions about the whole presentation, please write in the chat box now, because I will still have the chance to pick up on those. So I just wanted to finish with this very interesting idea around focusing on age. And I think all of us who work with the literature of young learners are very familiar with this umbrella metaphor that, it's a huge umbrella term, working with children. They could be as young as 3 years old or as old as, secondary level students. And that's obviously true, and the umbrella has to be opened, and we have to look at the different age groups. But of course, we mustn't forget that age is also, what it is it's a social label. And in the societies that we're very familiar with, and I count here myself and my colleagues, most Western societies, certainly age is very significant. And in other societies, it's less so. People attach less importance to when someone was born and how old they are. In our societies, everything starts there. So, for example, when we talk to children, our first question to children we don't know is, "Oh, nice to meet you. How old are you?" So this is also nothing wrong with it, but it's just symptomatic of our primary focus on age and its central importance. And some sociologists argue that this is because we all have preconceptions about what children at different ages should be able to do or how they should behave. So if someone tells you, "I'm 10 years old," and they're behaving like a 5-year-old, you might raise your eyebrows or be a little bit surprised, at least. Even though age is, of course, arbitrary, because it is social convention and it is laws in our society that guides us who children are, So law will tell you, for example, that children are vulnerable individuals in society, usually under the age of 18. Laws and social conventions will also state when a child should go to school, what they can do, can't do, can they drink, can they drive, can they vote, can they get married, can they consent to research. And this is quite inconsistent. So, for example, you still have to have parents' consent for a 16-year-old, and yet they can get married. So it's a very interesting situation, and of course, it's always dependent on the historical time and the culture, because social convention and law changes with time. But whatever time you live in, it's a very fluid idea. There are no strict brackets, and no one can tell you who is a child and who is an adult. The two exist together as opposite ends, but where do you actually put the age bracket? So I think, even though what I've done today is I try to give examples of how you can do research with children from very young up to teenagers, I think there is a lesson for us all as teachers in perhaps also seeing beyond age and recognize that children are very different and unique individuals within each class, despite the fact that they share a birthday with each other. So, for example, in my primary project, some children were so inspired and did so well that they did way more than what I would have expected of a 9-year-old. And others may do a little less than what you would expect of a 9-year-old. And I think as much as we're opening the umbrella, we also need to see that these age groups are, a little bit more fluid than that. Okay, so I'm going to stop here because it's 6:51 now. Oh, 5:51 GMT, I think. Oh yes, I wanted to show you the references. So these are the 4 references that I mentioned earlier. So the Clark-Moss one is about the Mosaic approach. The Kopok one, Vicky Kopok, this is about children as peer researchers, lower primary. James and Prout is a book about this social approach to children, working with children as researchers. And then the Mary Kellett book is the How to Develop Children as Researchers, which is a very practical book, a step-by-step guide, as it says in the title, to the whole process. So this is really my last slide. So thank you very much for all of you who stayed and listened. This is my email. If you want to send me further questions, I'm be very happy to respond. So I do think I have a couple of minutes to maybe address some of the questions. A lot of agreement, I think, with what I've been talking about. Oh, somebody is asking me, did I involve special needs children? And as it happens, I did involve somebody in my study in the primary school, and it was very interesting that the particular child who had learning difficulties and special needs very naturally paired himself up with someone who was clearly used to working with him a lot. And this child often lost his own focus and opted out of the activity, but stayed throughout the whole project. And sometimes I gave him additional tasks, like, for example, at some point he became the photographer for the project. So he was taking photos of children's screens and the posters that we've made. So I think the trick was to allow him to do as much as he was motivated to do. But when he was motivated to do anything, he was very much encouraged to do the research. So he wasn't told, oh, you can't do it. was taught quite the opposite, that everyone can have a go. Okay, just trying to see whether there's maybe one more question that I could pick out. Yeah, I think a lot of people were just saying, thank you, nice ideas. We try them as well. Yeah, so somebody mentioned teamwork. That's also very relevant because the children will be working together a lot of the time, very naturally and meaningfully. I've got my moderator now, so
I was gonna help you with some questions. There was one about how to make the topic relevant. I wasn't sure if you saw it or not, but how to make the research topic relevant.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think it's always a good idea to brainstorm first. So don't go with their first idea, because later on they may have more ideas. But I think it's important to go with something that the children want to do. So it needs to be carefully brainstormed. If they disagree, then sometimes you can say, well, let's vote, or let's try this one first and next time the other. But in my experience, for example, in the questionnaire study, they were all very happily choosing their own topics, and no one interfered with it. No one said, oh, that's not such a good topic. For example, someone wanted to do a questionnaire about whether teachers like horror films. And I was very tempted to say, really? But then I thought, no, actually, if that's what they want to do, let them do it. And to be fair, they did a very good job of it.
Okay, thanks, Annamaria. I think that we got all the questions. There was lots of praise for you in the chat box rather than questions, which I agree. It was a really interesting talk, and again, lots for us to think about and reflect on, and reflect on with our students as well. So thank you very much for your talk. We are going to have, thank you, we are going to have a 9-10 minute break now. So we'll be back at 5 past for the next talk. Okay. Thank you. See you in a bit.